My name is Cornell Clayton. I'm the director of the Thomas S. Foley Institute here at WSU, and on behalf of the Institute, I want to welcome you out to our event today. We've had a very busy semester with our Coffee and Politics series, and the hits are, they keep coming today with Maria Chavez. Maria is an associate professor of political science at Pacific Lutheran University in Seattle. She's we are proud to say that she earned her Ph.D. in political science right here at WSU, and so she is one of our alum. Her areas of teaching and research interests include public policy, American government, and Latino politics. She is the author of 2 books, Living the Dream, New Immigration Policies and the Lives of Undocumented Latino Youth, which was published in 2015 by Routledge, and Everyday Injustice, Latino Professionals and Racism, which was published in 2011, and which won the American Political Science Association Latino Caucus Best Book Award. Of course, I've known Maria for some years now, since she was a student here, and I followed her career with some interest. But I was reminded just recently that we needed to get her back here to campus when I saw a TEDx talk that she gave earlier this year on the subject of Latino youth, which will be the topic of her conversation today. So join me now in welcoming Maria Chavez.
Well, I'd just like to say it's an honor to be back at WSU. Thank you so much, Richard, for organizing this trip, and thank you so much, Cornell, for the invitation. And of course, thank you to Nick Loveridge, who I would not be here, standing up here, if it wasn't for Nick Loveridge, but that's another talk. But anyway, it is a huge honor to be back at my alma mater. And it's been too long. I was reminded this morning when I met with a group of faculty and staff at breakfast, it's been since 2002. And I don't want to age myself too much, so I'll just leave it at that. Thank you so much. It's great to be back here. But I'd like to start my presentation with situating myself as an academic. This is a picture of my parents, and the reason I put them up is, yes, I'm an associate professor of political science, focusing on American government and race, but it was a very unlikely path for me to become an academic. My father went, he was born in Colima, Mexico, and he went maybe to the 1st grade. And my mother, though a U.S. citizen, was raised in a segregated area in Northern California, and she didn't quite finish the 9th grade because she kept getting pulled out of school to work in the fields. My siblings and I were all tracked in a vocational track in a really bad, I would venture to say, one of the worst school districts in California. In fact, I went online the other day, and 82% of their students today don't meet math standards. And then I collect on ethnicity and race. 89% of Latino students still don't meet math standards. So I was thinking, what was it like in the 80s? Now I'm really dating myself, when I went. And so it was, as an academic now, but also the daughter of working class Latino immigrants, my research and teaching are really focused on making my life's work be applicable in some way. And so I really like to provide information that help inform real public policy problems. And, hopefully the information that my co-authors and I uncovered here can help us with that. Richard, let's see if it comes back up.
Was that postponed thing we didn't do?
Oh, okay. Okay, so while it restarts, I will just talk a little bit about the importance then. The next slide is supposed to focus on the importance of immigration. And it's shutting down. All right, then. I can do it without this. Who needs PowerPoints? They're just a bunch of pictures. My parents are gorgeous. They don't look like that anymore. That's why I like to show their picture. But anyway, is this going to eventually go back on?
It will come back on in just a moment.
Okay.
I will come and restart it.
Okay, well, while that restarts, I'd like to talk about the importance of immigration and situate my comments. Now that flubbed me up. Law professor Hiroshi Matamura says that immigration is one of the most pressing issues of our day. And it really is in terms of a public policy issue. Because, as he says, immigration is one of the most important areas of American public policy, for it literally determines who we are. And some of the most urgent questions, he goes on, about immigration involve immigration outside the law. So we're really talking about undocumented immigration. And for immigrants outside the law, for those that are undocumented, you really need workable solutions that are politically viable, durable, and think long-term. And so the main problems with immigration I find, because we haven't thought long term, because we are in a situation where there's such a backlash against immigrants, is that, and because Congress hasn't passed immigration reform, comprehensive immigration reform, or any reasonable immigration reform, we have the breakup of families right now. There's a high number of deportations, and about 5,000 children have been placed in foster care because of the breakup of families. Over 50,000 children are missing either one or more of their parents because of deportations in what is referred to as collateral damage. And a recent New York Times article states that 1 in 15 children living in the U.S. has at least one undocumented parent. So here, for 1 in 15 children, they live with the fact that, or the knowledge that the federal government could take their parents away. And that's a crazy, thing to live with. It impacts their cognitive development. It impacts their educational development. It creates clinical anxiety. So that's one of the problems, the breakup of families. The other problem is the short-term solutions that we've been seeing. The Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals is a short-term solution. It's not really addressing the problem of immigration. And President Obama could have as easily given them student visas or travel visas. In other words, it doesn't change their legal status in any way. Does it provide some measure of protection? Of course, but it doesn't fundamentally give them a path to becoming part of the society. So now what's going on?
So that's the reason.
Oh, goodness. Okay. So you guys are going to get the quick pictures in a second. So the focus of my talk then is the de-Americanization of Latino youth. And that's basically, I'm talking about the group of students who were brought here as children and many times don't even know they're undocumented until they need to apply for driver's licenses, until they need to start applying for financial aid, applying for colleges, until they have their first experience where they're going to go travel somewhere. And so all their lives they've thought of themselves as American. In many ways, more so than Mexican Americans like me, because I had the privilege of citizenship, I would be able to travel to Mexico. And so I would be familiar with an area, with a land that, while I didn't consider it my home, I understood it. The people who don't have documentation can't even travel there. So they don't even, here they belong to a country they may have not visited since they were 3. And so that makes their experience even more precarious. So, for example, just a couple of quotes of what that de-Americanization means. Daniel, this is the quote that I said in my TED Talk. He says, like I'm an American. I feel like I'm an American, and that I have every right that an American has. But just because I wasn't born in this country, I don't deserve like that. Like all these years I've been trying to be an American as much as I could be. And he even sounds like an American. He uses like a lot, for example. All those filler words. He talks like us. And Bianca, another student who's been in the country since the age of 8, she says, that's when it hits you, when you realize you're in the system, but they don't really want you to contribute because you don't have that number, and you feel discouraged, thrown out, segregated, like a leftover. And so right now there are 5 million people who grow up in this situation, and they find themselves de-Americanized as they grow up. And hopefully I will have a PowerPoint soon, because I actually thought, I don't need my stinking notes. I would have just done it with the PowerPoint, and then I wouldn't have had either. I would have just done a song and dance up here.
It's 1980s technology there.
Oh, I see. Yeah, well, this might have been here when I was here. And so the lack, and this is all due to the lack of reasonable immigration reform. I don't know if any of you have seen the Frontline immigration battle that was on last week. I mean, it was okay. Most of it was following Luis Gutierrez, congressman from Illinois, talking about what he did to try to get the House to vote for the Senate bill. So it was a little too heavy on the Luis Gutierrez part, and maybe not so much on the actual work to try to get a vote. But the point of it was that Congress has been incapable of fixing this problem. It's been incapable of fixing a lot of problems, but this one has very serious impacts to a lot of people, like I said, with the collateral damage and breaking apart of families. So because of breaking apart of families, and because it puts people at a huge economic and political disadvantage, here we go. Now it's going to sing to me. Sociology professor, and I was told not to leave this space, but so it's okay.
You're allowed out of the box now.
I can get out of the box for a second. So sociology professor Golash Boza says we don't have an undocumented immigration problem. What we have is a legislation problem. And so we're not seeing it the right way. It's not a, if we look at it from that context, now I don't know if I... Okay, yeah.
Sorry about that.
So we'll see. We'll just skip my... Okay, so this was the good old quote that I said, but it's not as important as... I won't reread it, but that's why it's so important. And especially when you talk about undocumented immigration. And I've already kind of talked about the breakup of families, short-term solutions, and the de-Americanization with those quotes that I just gave. But this is where I was. It's really a legislation problem. Gulash Boza says immigrants aren't criminals, rather our immigration laws are failing us, particularly failing immigrants and their families, which include U.S. citizens who are being separated by their parents. And she states, what renders some migrants illegal is the lack of legislation that enables undocumented migrants to obtain proper documentation. So Gulash Boza then argues that we need to see immigrants in a humane way. They're human beings. And if we understand that immigrants who come to this country have a history of political and economic and social ties to the U.S. If we talk about immigration solely from a punitive perspective and in an ahistorical perspective, we're not going to come up with a good solution. We may come up with good sound bites, we may come up with things that rile people up, but really we have to take into account the fact that historically we have encouraged migration from Mexico since the early 1900s. And then we've discouraged it when we've had economic hard times. So here before, we encouraged migration in 1919, then we have the Great Depression, and we have the repatriation where we send Mexicans back. And then during World War II, we have a labor shortage, so we encourage the braceros to come, which is how my grandfather came. And then we have another economic downturn, and we have Operation Wetback, and it was really called Operation Wetback. And so we have this history of circular migration. And some people argue we also have an addiction to undocumented labor. And so we have this supply and demand situation with labor, a historical and economic connection with Mexico, and then we have this situation where we have their children who were raised here, but they're criminalized instead. We're even criminalizing babies, anchor babies. The term anchor babies. The 14th Amendment is still around, and so anchor baby really means just American baby, but because Latinos have been criminalized out of it. And I really like this quote by Motomuro as well. Unauthorized migration often prompts the skeptical question, why not just get in line and come legally like my grandparents did? The answer is that many would-be immigrants are not allowed to come legally. There is no line for them. Saying let them get in line is like saying let them eat cake. And the reason I like this quote is because theoretically there may be a line, but it's an unrealistic one with regards to our economic and supply and demand forces, our well-established historical patterns of invitation of circular migration between the U.S. and Mexico, and with the results of unintended consequences from policies like NAFTA. And so really get them in line is, why don't they get in line is not dealing with reality. And so who are the dreamers? The dreamers are people who qualify under the Development Relief and Education for Alien Minors Act, an act that was, it was a bipartisan act with Orrin Hatch of Utah and Dick Durbin, who in 2001 said, let's legalize the children of undocumented immigrants. So basically, if you were brought here under the age of 16, and the qualifications have changed over the years as the different iterations of the bill have come out. If you're under 30, if you've been in the U.S. for at least 5 years, if you don't have a criminal record, and if you have a high school diploma and or are willing to serve in the military, then you can get a pathway to citizenship under the DREAM Act. But even this simple piece of it's not simple, but even this slice of the comprehensive immigration reform has not been successful. And every year since 2001, when it's been introduced, it has failed. And so Plyler versus Doe is the pre-Dreamer case. And what happened is in the 1970s, various school districts in Texas decided they weren't going to provide public education to the children who were undocumented. So they were asking for social security numbers, and they were asking for taxes. Either you pay a tax or a tuition or a fee. Basically, taxing poor families out of public education. And it went up to the Supreme Court. And the importance of this is the Supreme Court said, in fact, during some of the testimony, Marshall says to the the attorneys, if there's a fire in an undocumented child's house, should the fireman go? Because if that's the kind of thing you're saying, that there are, and then the attorney said, of course he should, and the response was, no, there are more important children needing fire protection. And so Plyler really then had some special lessons, and one of them was, people deserve constitutional protection regardless of their status. Even if you're an immigrant outside the law, you have a right to 14th Amendment constitutional protections, and that's what Plyler said. The other lesson from Plyler is immigration is a federal issue. It is not Arizona, you can do your own thing and ask people like me for my papers. It is not, what Texas was trying to do. It is a federal issue. And so Montemurra again states about Plyler, the United States is a nation of immigrants, a nation with borders, but also a nation committed to a sense of equality and human dignity. And that was the lesson from Plyler. And the DREAM Act is part 2 of that. Because as the picture says, now what? So now you have all these kids who have gone K through 12, but they can't do anything else. They were raised in this country, yet they're done. They can't work. Up until DACA, all this was going on. And it's a huge problem, because 65,000 new Dreamers graduate from high schools every single year. And so that's why passing the DREAM Act is so significant. It's the very next step. However, it hasn't happened. Instead, the Dreamers got deferred action for childhood arrivals, and in the summer of 2012. And that's, again, a temporary solution for that uses many of the same qualifications as the DREAM Act, but it's not a good solution. And the political context at the time was, this is the presidential election, and Romney's position, the Republican position on the side. Well, first Rick Perry states, and in a YouTube that I'm not even going to attempt to do after this, these technical difficulties. In a YouTube, Rick Perry says, if you don't provide education for children who were raised in this country, you don't have a heart. And he didn't last long after that. Romney's position was self-deportation. Make things so uncomfortable in this country that they'll just get out. Well, get out to where? Like I said, they don't know Mexico. And so Obama's position, if this works, was Alt-Tab, and help. Okay, this I could read his quote, but he says it better. Alt-Tab. Okay. Yay. This was Obama's position.
It makes no sense to expel talented young people who, for all intents and purposes, are Americans. They've been raised as Americans, understand themselves to be part of this country. To expel these young people who want to staff our labs or start new businesses or defend our country simply because of the actions of their parents or because of the inaction of politicians.
Okay, so that was the
It
context.
makes no sense to expel
Stop.
talented young people.
You guys are getting the whole deal here. Okay, and so slideshow. Slide. All right, so I wanted to see what is it like to grow up undocumented. I mean, I knew growing up what it felt like, especially in Northern California, to grow up as a Latina. I knew the stigma of what that meant, especially because my father worked in the fields for the vice principal of the school. But I also didn't have the kinds of obstacles that these kids had. And so I wanted to see what their experiences were like. And I was very limited in what I could do and find out in Washington and Oregon, because we're not traditionally heavy Latino states. It's 11% of the population, roughly, in both states. So I asked a colleague of mine, Melissa Michelson, if she wanted to be a co-author and collect data in Texas, in California, and Jessica Lavariega Manforti if she wanted to be a co-author and collect data in Texas. So we had 2 non-traditional Latino states and 2 traditional Latino states, and we compared responses in terms of what is it like to be raised in this country without documentation. And I just want to make a small statement about, we wanted to really hear their stories. We wanted to understand where they were coming from. And while we're not pretending that this is a representative sample, we do think that their stories provide some insights into the experience of what their lives were like. So I like Harvard professor Marshall Gantz writes in Why Stories Matter that he says, a story communicates fear, hope, and anxiety. And because we can feel it, we get the moral, not just as a concept, but as a teacher of our hearts. But stories and experiences aren't often valued in the social sciences. And I mean, we've all heard the positivist debates in the social sciences, and they can be fierce. So the value of quantitative research over qualitative methods is often seen in an either-or way. But my first book looked at the experiences of the social and political and civic experiences of Latino lawyers, and in that one I used both quantitative and qualitative methods, but even that was a hard sell. So I'll forever be grateful to Nick Leverich, who believed in my methods, because I got turned down for every single dissertation grant I applied to. I applied to HUD, I applied everywhere, and I just kept getting rejection after rejection, and I was thinking, how am I going to do this? Send out these surveys, conduct this research, get the mailing address from the Bar Association. So of course Nick Leverich saved the day and supported not only my dissertation research as my chair, but he paid for the surveys and he paid for the mailing address of the attorneys. I was so lucky. Like I said, you know, it's just such an honor to be back at WSU with the people who helped me become an academic. Although there are some things I wish you had told me. But that's another talk too. But anyway, I wouldn't be here without the fine folks in this room. And their support came at critical times, especially because I was feeling vulnerable about my methods. It didn't seem like my choice in methods and my choice in topics was valued in the larger discipline of political science. And so for this study, we really wanted to get the stories of the dreamers and see what they could teach us, what insights they could teach us about living life in the legal shadows. And so this, again, I'm not saying this is a representative sample in any way, but they do provide some insights. And there are some things that are eerily similar to national trends. So one of the things that's interesting is 71% of our group is in a mixed status household, meaning some of the people in their household are citizens and some are undocumented. And that has created a lot of tension in the families. Sometimes moms are now using the social security numbers of their child, and then that child, when that person wants to apply for a driver's license, even though that person's a citizen, can't. Also, we had a lot of tension in that younger siblings had it made, according to the older siblings. They could go off to travel abroad. They could go to, they could do all kinds of stuff and go to prestigious schools, whereas the undocumented siblings in the household had to hustle at 2 different community colleges. Another thing, sometimes it also was bad for the citizen. Sometimes the citizen children would give all their financial aid to their undocumented siblings because they had other options. They could work and that kind of thing. So the other thing, educational status, the people we interviewed obviously are not represented in their education. 40% of dreamers don't even make it through high school. And yet, 70% of the people we interviewed were in college. So we really are looking at a slice of the cream of the crop, if you will. And that's it's a fair criticism to say this is not a representative sample. But the average age of arrival in our group was 7 years old. So they were young. Politics meant nothing to them. They were still watching cartoons, losing their baby teeth. They were in 2nd grade, 1st and 2nd grade. And so when they got here, this was really new to them, the average age of finding out was pre-adolescence, because that's when they started getting their opportunities to travel, to do sports events, and that's when they started finding out that they had limitations. But even then, they didn't quite get what kind of limitation this was going to be. So that's the interesting part, I think, about what we have found, especially the mixed status families and the age of arrival. And so we asked them, how did you find out about your immigration status? And here's one representative quote, it was my senior year. I had all my friends leaving out for college. I was voted most likely to succeed in my high school. So it's kind of hard for me to come and stay at Texas Penn America. And so, again, it didn't quite sink in what these barriers were going to be until later. One thing I didn't ask, I made the survey that we had just gone through human subjects, which was a nightmare when you were going to do undocumented people. So we'd gone to 3 rounds of human subjects, and then Obama announces DACA, and that night I wake up at 4 in the morning and rechange the entire survey, because now we're going to focus it on DACA rather than the DREAM Act. And while I'm doing that, because, again, I situated my talk with, I come from an immigrant background, so I'm very interested in how Latinos are integrated or not in society. Well, one of the things that I don't have on my radar is deportation. I didn't ask a single question in the survey about deportations, yet that came up over and over and over again, because it's such a scary factor for people. And this Hector says there's always the fear of deportation, of being ripped away from your family, your school, your friends, everything you've ever known, especially if you've been here at such a young age. It's really quite daunting and quite terrifying. We had people say, you know, the whole time I was going through high school, I kept thinking, what if my parents get deported? How am I going to quit high school and support my younger sister? And so, you know, kids were trying to figure out how to support younger siblings. And this person was just let me get through high school so that I can support my younger sister. We had, you know, normally if you have a traffic holdup or something, the first thing that they would think is, did they get deported? And so those kinds of fears were something that were definitely on their radar. But by and large, one of the questions was, has been undocumented, have you made decisions about where to go to school after high school and what to do after graduation that relates to your immigration status? Over and over again, people said education. That was the next stage in life. That's the next decision they had to make after high school, and it impacted their education the greatest. One example is one of our respondents was the student body president at Fresno State, and someone got a tip that he wasn't accepting the stipend for being president. So the Fresno Bee, the reporter said, are you not accepting it because you're undocumented? He'd been in this country since he was 3. And so he said, I thought about lying, but I said, yeah, it's because I'm undocumented. And then it was over. The student body council meetings started to be protested at. Katie Couric interviewed him. He went on CNN. He said he had to hide. There was a Deport Federal campaign going on, and so people were saying, people who weren't even part of the school were saying, we need to save that spot for a tax-paying citizen, and so he had to hide in a bubble for like a year, and just because he wasn't accepting the stipend. And that's just one example. He was a baby, he was a toddler when he was brought. Another person said, we're stuck in the border between Mexico and you can't go. You're stuck between the checkpoints and you can't go north. You're stuck with that stupid little checkpoint. Without risking it all, leaving my mom, leaving my brother, leaving my dad. I was applying to the University of Denton and I got in, but I couldn't go. I went to Pan America. So in Texas, they were geographically confined to the Rio Grande Valley because of the northern and southern internal checkpoints. So they couldn't even go anywhere. They couldn't even travel in Texas. They had to stay in the Rio Grande Valley. And talk about a burden. And then going back to Hugo's story, this is a different one. He was in the U.S. since he was a kindergartner. He was separated from his father when he was 4 years old. He's the oldest of 3 in a mixed status family. His parents had twins who were siblings. And he just talked about how his parents would say to the siblings, look at your brother. He doesn't have papers, and look how much he's been able to accomplish. And if you're raised in a Mexican household, it's totally okay to compare siblings. They do it all the time, and they don't read the how-to-parent books. Which caused a lot of tension between the siblings. It didn't help the situation at all. But he says, I applied to UCs, UCLA, UC Berkeley. I got into every school. But none of the schools gave me a scholarship. I didn't get anything. They said, congratulations, you've been accepted, but I knew I couldn't afford it. And so he was a star football player in high school. And he had to turn down these elite universities. And he was very private about his status. He said, I never wanted anyone to know about my status because I didn't want them to feel sorry for me or feel like I was different. I didn't want to be categorized as the other. So then he goes to Cal State LA, graduates with his bachelor's degree in 2.5 years with a 3.95 GPA, and is now a waiter, working 2 jobs. And so that is an example of the obstacles. He was in school here since he was in kindergarten, and he participated in all the events, and he had good friends, and he finds out in high school, this is where your life is going to take a dip. And so it stopped him from achieving many of the things. And so we said, another question, do you feel your future will be different because of this change in immigration policy? If so, how? And the first thing he says after all those experiences is, oh man, you know what's going to change? I'm actually going to be able to apply for a work permit. And when I get a work permit, I'm going to go straight to the DMV and apply for a driver's license. Get my driver's license. I feel like now part of my life is going to be real, you know. So here he couldn't go to Berkeley, and all he wants to do is be counted, get his driver's license. Most of these are kids just wanting to be kids. 5 million kids just wanting to be kids in the only country that they know. But mostly, they see themselves living in limbo. One of the questions we ask is, where do you see yourself in 5 years? Where do you see yourself in 10 years? And this is one of the representative answers. You can't plan. We're living in the moment. We live day by day. You know, we may get deported next year. We might get deported in 5 years. So how can you make a plan, or how can you plan your life if you don't know where you're going to be? And so that's really the sense of they're still living in limbo. And many of you probably know Vargas. He's a Filipino who came out as undocumented and came out as gay, and started a movement that says, why can't we include dreamers who've grown up here as American citizens? And so his movement is very important in that. This one, another thing we discovered was identity confusion. We said, very simply, when asked to describe your ethnic identity, which term would you most likely use? And Leticia says, I think I'm Mexican. I mean, I don't know, because I do love myself as American, but then I do love being Mexican because I was born here, and I kind of feel this is my home. And the interviewer says, born here, because we screened out people who were citizens, and she starts laughing. I mean, not born here, you know. I just feel like I was born here. So she's been in this country since she was a baby. Didn't find out she was undocumented until she was 17, and now actually in her head thinks of herself as being born here. And so there's a huge, her confusion is very telling. Another thing we found is that the really deferred action for childhood arrivals was too little, too late. We conducted these interviews right in the summer when DACA was announced, the month afterwards. And yet the respondents knew the details. Some of them had already seen lawyers. They had been to nonprofits talking about how to do it. And yeah, things were going to change. Like Hugo could get his driver's license. They could work safely, even if it was just 2-year increments. They could travel freely. They could live without fear of deportation. But it really doesn't change their legal status at all. They're still undocumented. It's not a pathway to become documented. It's a temporary short-term solution. And some people were very hopeful about it, and they said, you know, es para lo mejor, me podría estudiar y darle una mejor vida a mi hija, la que yo no tuve, o sea, cambiaría mi vida por completo. So this person thinks it's wonderful, it'll change her life completely. But really, the danger of DACA is, as this person says, it's a gamble. Here they're going to show all their documents, including where they live, and this was before the parent version that's now held up in courts. And so they're submitting their applications, taking a leap of faith because they're desperate and have no other options. So really, we're not chess pieces that you can just, move around any way you want. We're actually human beings. We have dreams. We have aspirations. So they definitely felt this statement reflects intense marginalization and lack of a political voice in this situation. And so I think that what the example of their lives really points to is what Joe Fagan calls the white racial frame, which he says it's a way that we've established the United States, first with slavery, that white Anglo-Saxon Protestant culture is at the top, and every other culture is inferior to it. And that's structurally, historically, and politically, according to Fagan, the foundation of racial inequality in the U.S. Another thing is assimilation has always meant one-way assimilation. Assimilation hasn't included the fact that, for example, I speak English and I speak Spanish. It is seen as zero-sum in many cases. The fact that I speak Spanish doesn't take away from the fact that I can speak English, other than maybe I get my verb tenses wrong in both languages. So it's not zero-sum, but we've always seen it that way. And so we have lots of stereotypes and racialized experiences that are with us to this day. And currently the example of immigrants is one good one. For example, Iowa Representative Steve King's statement in July of 2013, where he said, "For everyone who's a valedictorian, there are another 100 out there weighing 130 pounds, and they've got this calves the size of cantaloupes because they're hauling 75 pounds of marijuana across the desert." So that kind of anti-immigrant rhetoric is illustrative of common stereotypes of Latinos as drug smuggling criminals who are going to bring harm to America. And so the language of around alien, illegal, anchor baby, all of those are things that equates Latinos as always un-American, as always foreign, rather than as citizens in waiting, like other immigrant groups have been. And as law professor Bill Ongeen states, the discussion of who is and who is not American, who can and cannot become American, goes beyond the technicalities of citizenship and residency requirements. It strikes at the very heart of our nation's long and troubled legacy of race relations. So this has led to a situation where millions of young people who've lived in the United States for the majority of their lives are trapped in a society that until President Obama's DACA would not allow them to live out in the open. And it has affected every area of their life, even their romantic partners. One person in our interview said, after I broke up with my boyfriend, he threatened to call ICE on me. And so they had to be careful even in that situation. And so the results of the right racial frame then can be seen in our history of xenophobic and nativism, including the most recent criminalization of immigrants, which impacts our public policy choices, including doing nothing, such as not having reasonable immigration reform. And this doing nothing isn't going to cut it anymore because our demographics are changing so much. And currently 1 in 5 Americans identifies as Latinos, and Latinos are the fastest growing ethnic and racial segment of the population, and by 2040 will be 30% of the population. A quarter of public school kids are Latinos right now. A quarter of them. And so the development of a true ethno-racial democracy demands at the very least that dreamers be incorporated into society. And here's a quote from one of our respondents. Before I was, I didn't exist. I didn't have a number. So you're in a shadow, but now I'm going to exist. There's going to be a record of me. I'm going to have like an identification. I'm going to have a number. Something like just a driver's license or social security card was so important to them. And I think this is a very telling quote from Sarah. I'll no longer have to be scared anymore. I can feel like I'm part of this country, this is post-DACA, which has rejected me so much, even though I grew up here. I went to school here, graduated with honors, work here, pay taxes. I can actually feel like I'm going to be part of this country because I have the numbers that apparently make you part of this country. So that's the biggest one. I'll no longer have to be scared or feel like I'm living under the shadows. And so I started with Plyler and the lessons of Plyler, which according to Montemurro are, again, the United States is a nation of immigrants, a nation with borders, but also a nation committed to a sense of equality and human dignity. And I really like this quote, government policies can change, and sometimes they should change, but justice first requires dealing fairly with the consequences of prior policies. And so if we've had public policies that have actively recruited Latino laborers into this country, but we don't see their children, or at least them, as ever citizens in waiting, then that's not dealing justly with the consequences of prior policy. So reasonable immigration reform needs to take the long view. As Hiroshi Montemurro argues, comprehensive immigration reform must go beyond immediate political election cycles and have the courage to work towards what will matter several generations from now. And so based on my research, I argue that it's important to give unauthorized Latino youth a path to citizenship, not short-term dead-end solutions, and fix their legal status. Do I know the appropriate way to fix long-term immigration challenges? I don't, especially in a climate that is so hostile that we can start talking about anchor babies. So I don't understand, and especially in a climate where Congress is so incapable of governing. But I do know that we need to have a pragmatic approach. We need to have deliberation. Mostly we need to have a view that Latinos are part of this country, that we are citizens in waiting and not just laborers, that we are actually a foundational group in society, not just outsiders or criminals, because the status quo isn't going to cut it. And I'd like to just close, if we do nothing, I think the consequences of being torn apart from one's family, of being disadvantaged economically and socially, and of being treated as an outsider in the country you can grow up, will derail people's lives in very damaging ways. Even as a citizen, I almost derailed my life in so many ways, so many times. But I had the privilege of citizenship, and I had the ability to not have these insurmountable legal obstacles in my path. Other people don't have that. And so lack of reasonable immigration reform then leaves 5 million undocumented Latino youth feeling like leftovers in really vulnerable positions, unwanted and disregarded by the only country that they know, de-Americanized in a land of immigrants. And I love this FDR quote that reminds us, remember, remember always, that all of us, and you and I especially, are descendants from immigrants and revolutionists. Thank you.
We have about 15 minutes for questions and answers. Maybe I'll start, in some ways, Maria, the story you tell is not a new one. I mean, we have a history in this country of blaming immigrants at different periods in our history when we have economic transformations and cultural transformations.
Yeah, when are we going to learn?
Well, that's a good question. So I wonder how you see the predicament today, the discussion today, the conversation today about immigrants as different in these earlier periods, like during the mid-19th century, the Know Nothing movement, or
Yes.
some of the strains of the populist movement before. How do you see it different, and how do you see us starting to address the ugly nature of the conversation today, personified by people like Trump and others?
Oh, that's a great question. Gosh, how do I see it different? Yeah, you know, the movement to remove the Chinese Exclusion Act, when the Chinese were only 2% of the population in California at the time. There's so many examples of removing the other. I mean, that's why Montemurro talks about why we needed Mexicans, because we got rid of the Asians. And so that's what started that in the early 1900s. I guess it's easier to see how it's similar. And it's, unfortunately, the similarity is usually it's an other by race, because people who are Italian could eventually blend in, right? People who were German, Canadian, people who are white could blend in eventually. People who are phenotypically different can't as easily. And I think what continues now is that this kind of racialization of immigrants makes people think all Latinos are immigrants. And there's a public opinion poll that said that many Americans mistakenly think 40% of Latinos in the U.S. are undocumented immigrants. 40%. And so, when the reality is, it's, you know, we're 50 million people, and there's 10 million or 11 million undocumented people. It's not 40%, you know? So I guess now the spillover is to people who've been here for generations. And Latinos have been here for generations. Maybe not so much in Washington and Oregon. That's why I wanted to get California and Texas. And what was the second part of your question?
So how do we start addressing, you know, some of the comments by people like Donald Trump? I mean, it's tapping into some deeper concerns Americans have about cultural changes, economic changes.
Yes.
How do we start addressing that in a constructive fashion?
That's a good point, because you also have...
What's the question?
Oh, go ahead. How do you counter the Donald Trumps in a constructive way? And I think that sometimes pragmatic approaches help. Realistically, is Mexico going to build a fence for you? You know what I mean? And are you realistically going to get rid of 11.2 million people? And so maybe for the people who are racists at heart, we can get to them on a pragmatic level. So we're here. Now what do we do? And but right now, because the conversation has been so dominated by the Trumps, any kind of immigration discussion is all punitive. It's the fence. It's the deportations. It's the where's the other part? There's saying pass the DREAM Act is saying you're giving illegals amnesty, and so I think you cannot just have a punitive conversation. It has to include, if you want, put a fence up. More power to you. Many academics have said it doesn't work. It's a waste of taxpayer dollars. Douglas Massey wrote a book, Beyond Smoke and Mirrors, where it increases our taxes. It creates more deaths at the borders. It's ineffective, but it's good symbolic policy. So I think that pragmatically, I don't know. I mean, has anyone seen the YouTube by Robert Reich, where he's actually taking Trump's points and saying, yeah, they pay taxes, yeah, they do this, and he's debunking all of. But then I went down to the comments, and they were awful. Americans were saying awful things about Robert Reich. And so if you're, a professor at Berkeley who was Clinton's Secretary of Labor, who actually knows his stuff with regards to the economic impact of immigrations, if he's being targeted in such a, I don't know where the root. I guess your question addresses how do we stop hating each other, and that's a really hard one to do,
Yeah, I had a question really quick. I have a good friend of mine who's an undocumented student here, and his parents thought that DACA was essentially a trap, and they were asking people to register so they knew where they were at, so they could deport them in a couple years. And so he used a sibling's social security number and
Mm-hmm.
you know, a number of things. So he was committing a federal offense rather than registering with DACA because of this fear of being deported and things
totally.
like that. So as we make these kind of pragmatic approaches, is there a big culture of distrust that we have to get around in the community? And is there a realistic way of doing that?
Absolutely. There's a huge, some of my other work, I interviewed 555 migrant seasonal farm workers in Idaho when I was at Boise State, and to see how distrusting they were in the community. And, you know, I thought they wouldn't trust white people, but they also don't trust Mexican Americans. They're so vulnerable, they don't trust anybody. And there's a good reason for that. Operation Wetback, repatriation, we can think of all these examples of, I mean, in my family, my dad was a permanent resident until he became a citizen after Bob Dole's anti-immigrant rhetoric, which was nothing compared to today. He did not want any government in our life, and you know, anything. You know, if there was a policy, we were poor. If there was a program, it didn't matter. It was he did not want the state in our house because of that lack of trust. And yeah, two of my research assistants for this project were undocumented. And they said, should I apply for DACA? And I said, are you crazy? Not until after the election. What if Romney wins? Then what are you going to do? You've just let the government know where your undocumented parents and family live. And so, yeah, there is a big, huge lack of trust in the community. I don't know how you get around it because the U.S. has a long, 5,000 kids living in foster care right now. Are those kids, and for the sole, it should take a lot more than your parents trying to work to provide for you to be taken away and put in a system that is very difficult to get you back. So yeah, there's a lack of trust there, and for very good reason.
Especially at the university level, how do you think, what kind of challenges do international students face, especially when they're trying to obtain citizenship after graduation?
Okay, well, the international students is a different issue, right? Because you're here on are you an international student?
No.
Oh, because they're usually here on student visas, right?
Yeah.
And if they want to stay here, then obviously I don't know what the path or problems or obstacles they're going to have are, but there are, I don't know, are you an international student? Okay then. Well, see, I don't know. It's a different issue. It's a different issue because it's,
We tried to deport him.
oh, did you overstay your visa? So, but it's really that, right? Once you're not a student, you have to leave, unless you get a job or something. And so, yeah, it's a totally different issue. These are kids who've grown up here and have not had the option of travel and have not had they don't know another country. They're an underclass, a permanent underclass in our, democracy. And so that's a completely different issue. Yeah.
You used the word underclass, and that made me wonder, is this something that major corporate interests are for or against? When I think of a problem in Congress, I usually think corporations are against it.
Mm-hmm.
But I can't see how not solving this problem would benefit corporations. But then again, when you mention underclass, is it this group of workers who are forced to work in miserable conditions, not enough pay, all of that, because of that they maintain this lack of documentation?
Well, for this population it is, but many corporations are very much in favor of immigration reform, like Microsoft, because they get a lot of their workers from India. And so immigration reform would make it easier for them too. But again, we're dealing with different populations. Right? They're wanting immigration reform, so it's easier to recruit the best and the brightest from all over the world. And this is a group that's already here. So, but yeah, I think that a lot of corporations see the benefit. I gave a talk at the Washington Mainstream Republicans group in Wenatchee a few years ago. The farmers want immigration reform. So a lot of different economic interests want it. The thing that's stopping it in Congress, I think, is the extreme right, the Tea Party community. That as soon as there's any talk of immigration reform, you start hearing the amnesty, and so there's that backlash. Mm-hmm.
You've talked about this being a legislative issue, and Congress is always slow to act. If you think about previous rights movements, it's really been a groundswell from cities and from the state. Within the legislative component, what are things that at the state level and at local level can be done that can actually advance this?
That's a good question. Again, with Plyler, it's a federal issue at the end of the day. But certain states are doing things. For example, Washington State has its own version of the DREAM Act. About 12 other states have their own versions of the DREAM Act. And Washington State just passed the college, remind me. Now, pardon? College Bound, where they have access to financial aid as well. So Washington State is doing it. It's a much nicer climate for undocumented, although we have the Northwest Detention Center in Tacoma, and it's still a scary place for lots of other reasons because of that. But you definitely have states that are starting, and the states have changed. There are 12 different ones that we mentioned in the book that are passing state DREAM Acts. That's where the hope is. Anymore, that's where the hope for any legislation is at the state level, I think. Does that answer your question? Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah.
How do you plan to use your research to influence legislation?
I would love it if these stories would make them think, yeah, maybe we need to do something. I would love that. Am I hopeful that that's going to happen? Not at all. Yeah, I like, here's a bunch of insights that we have. This really challenges us as a democracy that we can continue doing this. And so if this piece could add to the conversation, I think it would be great. Yeah.
I'm more optimistic.
Oh, good. Somebody has to be.
I watched Dreamers come and give testimony in the state legislature for passing Washington Dream Act,
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of politicians changed their thinking, and I think these stories have to be captured and processed. You think there's room for optimism, or is it always going to be Chinese Exclusion Act all over again?
Honestly? Well, I was thinking of some of the stories, and for example, one kid got accepted to UCLA, but he couldn't go because he didn't have documentation. So he went to the financial aid office and said, is there anything we can do? Anything we can do? And the financial aid officer said, don't waste your time, excuse the language, get your ass to work. You don't need to be here. And so that kid never forgot that. It really affected him. And then he went to Cal State Los Angeles, got his degree. And then he was at some kind of government mixer thing, and he sees that financial aid officer because the UCLA and the assembly were doing something. And he goes up to him and goes, remember you said this to me? It was 7 years later. And he said, and I got my degree. I didn't just... So the point of that one is, until we get rid of the white racial frame, until we get rid of seeing Latinos as outsiders, as not citizens in waiting, we're going to have people who think of us as laborers, who think that we're wasting our time in academia, and that, I guess until, like Olash Boza says, we see immigration as a human problem that needs to be solved, because we're not seeing each other as human beings anymore. We're not seeing Latinos we're seeing them as lawbreakers. They're criminals. And has anyone watched that interesting documentary, 9500 Liberty? It's about a town in Manassas, and it's what happens when these two communities come together, a huge increase in Latinos, and this couple just decided to videotape the interactions in the county commission meetings, and it was so ugly. People just demonized each other. And so the only optimism I guess I have is that the status quo can't stay the same. How can we continue to call ourselves a democracy when we keep 5 million people in limbo with part-time 2-year solutions? That it's a big smear on who we are and our values. And do our values eventually win out? I guess over time they do, right? Tell me they do. We did have civil rights legislation, but none of that ultimately matters if we don't get rid of the racism, if we don't get rid of the xenophobia. Because what's the next group that we're going to target? Is it going to be people from the Middle East? Is it going to be those people that are so different because of blah, blah, blah? Until we get rid of that fear of the other, we might always have another group. The Canadians, forget the Canadians. They're in trouble.
We have time for one last question.
I had a question. So, considering like the shift in power in Congress right now, that the Republicans have control, the majority of it, what would you see the situation kind of changing to if like somehow Trump or like Bush was elected president, the Republicans gained total control almost of Congress? Like, how would you see acts like these being changed or affected?
Because the Republicans have been so unreasonable with immigration, that is where I'm optimistic. Because you are not going to win a presidential election without the Latino vote. And if, you know, the numbers, Latinos are not going to vote for Trump. Maybe Bush, I don't know. It just depends. He actually has some more compassionate views on immigration, which is probably why he's not going to make it to the primary. But just in Texas, Mitt Romney barely won Texas. Mitt Romney would not win Texas today because of the new registered Latino voters. So the future of Texas even not even being able to, send an electorate supporting the Republicans. So I guess I don't see. So Republicans have alienated African Americans. Now they're alienated Latinos. They've alienated gay people. Good luck, Republicans. I guess I have. So that's where I guess I am optimistic.
Okay, before I ask you and joining me in thanking our guest, a couple of quick announcements. First of all, if you want to know more about our upcoming events, like us on Facebook or send us an email. We'll put you on our distribution list.